There's a point in development where you stop asking, what does this mean? And begin asking, what environment allowed this meaning to form in the first place? That shift may sound subtle, but it's the difference between navigating life through reactions and navigating life through context. Most people spend their entire lives attending to the content of an experience. They fixate on the message, the behavior, the event itself. But content is only the expression. Context is the generator. And until you can read the generator, you're interpreting surface shadows while missing the machinery behind them. This week at the Blueprint level, it's not about interpretation or prediction. It's about the emergence of context vision. Context vision is what happens when the mind begins to recognize that meaning is not created inside the moment. Meaning emerges from the conditions surrounding the moment. You begin asking different questions. Not why did this happen, but what system did this moment grow out of? Not what did they mean by that, but what pattern consistently produces this kind of exchange. To explain this, imagine a chess player who only looks at the piece that just moved. They see the knight shift positions and immediately react to the isolated action. Compare that to a grandmaster who isn't really watching the pieces at all. They're watching the board as an ecosystem. They understand that a single move only matters inside of a field of relationships, strategies, and long-range tensions. The piece is not the point. The position is the point. That's what week 11 begins to awaken. The ability to sense the position of your experiences instead of getting hypnotized by the immediate move. This kind of perception rearranges your relationship to time. You stop treating the present moment as something self-contained. You begin noticing that each moment sits inside a lineage of small influences and subtle cues. Tone is shaped by the morning someone had before speaking to you. Silence is shaped by the emotional bandwidth available at the time. Even your own interpretations draw energy from whatever psychological environment you were in before the moment occurred. When you see this, the tightness around personalizing everything dissolves. You begin to realize that most interactions are less about intention and more about environmental momentum. This isn't detachment, it's comprehension. When people first learn to recognize content, something interesting happens. They become less reactive, not because they're calmer, but because they're more curious. Curiosity is the antidote to premature conclusions. Once your mind becomes fascinated with the conditions that give rise to behavior, rather than the behavior itself, you stop collapsing complexity into small explanations. You let the moment breathe long enough to reveal its architecture. And suddenly, things that once felt confusing begin to make sense without drama. Think of it like the pressure of the atmosphere. You don't see it, but it shapes everything. Conversations don't happen in a vacuum. They unfold inside psychological atmospheres. When the atmosphere is dense, the smallest comment hits hard. When the atmosphere is light, even a difficult truth lands cleanly. Reading the atmosphere is what gives you emotional intelligence beyond emotion. It gives you accuracy without suspicion, and insight without assumption. Another dimension of context vision is recognizing that your internal state is also an atmosphere. When you walk into a moment carrying tension, the context inside you will distort the meaning you assign to whatever happens next. When you walk in with spacious attention, your interpretations become more neutral, not softer, but more balanced. It's not about being kind or understanding, it's about recognizing that you are part of the environment that produces your own meaning. When that awareness comes online, you stop treating your interpretations as facts. You treat them as conditions that can be evaluated, updated, and refined. This is where consciousness matures. And once you learn to read context, you also begin to read the missing context, the things that weren't said, the pressure that no one named, the subtle misalignments that shaped outcomes before anyone realized what was happening. You begin to feel the contours of the unseen, not as intuition, but as interference. Your mind stops working like a spotlight and starts working like a weather system, tracking shifts in pressure rather than isolated points of light. This makes you far less susceptible to emotional misfires. When you can see the environment beneath the behavior, you stop interpreting everything through the narrow lens of personal meaning. You begin to understand that most experiences are multi-caused. They come from competing needs, overlapping histories, timing mismatches, cognitive bandwidth limits, and invisible constraints. And somehow this recognition doesn't complicate things, it simplifies them. The world becomes less mysterious because the mechanisms become visible. This is what the blueprint means when it says you're rising into higher cognition. It has nothing to do with being psychic or overly analytical. It has to do with recognizing that meaning is not the event. Meaning is the atmosphere that allows the event to take shape. When you learn to read atmosphere, you gain access to a level of understanding that most people mistake for intuition. In truth, it's simply perception operating with more data. A mind that sees context becomes a mind that cannot be easily fooled, either by others or by its own patterns. It becomes a mind that speaks differently, not because it's cautious, but because it's accurate. Becomes a mind that anticipates without predicting, because it understands how systems move. It becomes a mind that can finally recognize itself as an interpreter rather than a reactor. And once that shift happens, everything in your blueprint opens in a new way. Not because you learned more information, but because you stepped into the kind of awareness capable of using information correctly. There's a point in development when you realize that life was never shaped by events. It was shaped by the context in which you interpreted those events. The meaning you gave something at age 7 was not formed by the event itself. It was formed by the environment your mind was operating inside at the time. The moment you understand that, everything you thought was truth becomes interpretation under specific conditions. Your conditions have changed, but your interpretations haven't caught up. You've been reading your life with an outdated operating system. You've been using frameworks built by earlier versions of yourself to explain situations your current self is more than capable of understanding differently. Week 11 lifts this lens, not to show you what is true, but to show you how your perception has been structured. Once you see the structure, you stop mistaking your first meaning for the only meaning. You stop confusing familiar with accurate. You stop assuming that the speed of your interpretation equals the correctness of it. Your mind is not designed to give you truth, it's designed to give you continuity. It fills in gaps with whatever interpretation maintains your internal coherence, even if that interpretation is decades out of date. When you begin to see that, you start asking different questions. Not what does this mean, but what internal system generated that meaning. Not why did I react this way, but which version of me reacted. Not what did they do, but what conditions made my mind interpret it like that. That shift is the beginning of intelligence that doesn't rely on instinct or emotion. It relies on awareness of the mechanisms that shape both. The moment you can watch your mind construct meaning, not after the fact, but at the origin, you stop being governed by reflex. You step out of the role of participant and into the role of architect. You stop inheriting interpretations and start authoring them. And once you can author your interpretations, your entire life becomes editable. Not because the world changes, but because you finally know how to change the systems inside you, the ones that are responsible for shaping the world that you see. When you reach that point, foresight isn't mystical. It's simply what happens when the mind is no longer blind to itself.